Sorry, you got me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a privilege to be speaking on the floor here this evening. Here we've been talking for some time about the huge deficit spending that's going on. In fact, Republicans have promised to make massive cuts, and the old story that used to be told about the fellow Texan, Sam Rayburn, about a young freshman Democrat coming up and saying, talking about how difficult things were here in the House, and that, gee, as a Democrat, it's obvious the Republicans are our enemy. They're trying to stop us from doing what we need to, and boy, the media's not helping, and Speaker Rayburn stopped him reportedly and said, son, the Republicans are not your enemy. The media's not your enemy. At the other end of the hall, the Senate, now they're your enemy. Well, I thought that was a strange story when I heard that about Speaker Rayburn. But the longer I've been here, the more we see so many great bills that have come out of the House in the last year, have gone down the hall, and are languishing for a lack of action. And so when I read that our friend down the hall, Leader Reid, is lambasting Republicans for do-nothing status, it was remarkable to me that they could have so many House bills sitting down there waiting to do something and yet doing nothing with them. Now, we have been trying to get bills passed into law that would make essential cuts. It's still, as our friend from East Texas, Bo Pilgrim, used to say, a mind-boggling thing to have seen this president come in 2009 with Speaker Pelosi in charge of the House and Leader Reid in charge of the Senate, and to know that we had been just vilified as majority Republicans in the House in 2006 for exceeding the amount of income coming in by $160 billion. Vilified. And yet when President Obama became the president and Leader Reid and Speaker Pelosi were in charge, we ran a deficit of 10 times that much in 1 year. Incredible. Now, one thing that should not have ever happened is to have our national security out on the table as a bargaining chip in the debt ceiling negotiation. But it was, and we were told that, gee, neither side is going to allow those kind of cuts to occur to our national security. And lo and behold, in being in Afghanistan, seeing the new year come in with our military men and women in some remote operating areas, went with Senator Jim Inhofe from Oklahoma and Joe Barton from Texas. Being in remote areas, it was amazing to hear some folks say we're already being told amounts that we're going to be cut because of the sequestration coming. Talking with some of our Texas Guard folks, I've been told over the last couple of weeks, we're already being told about monies that are being cut. These are people that are trying to protect and defend our country. I went to the deployment ceremony of a unit leaving from Lufkin, Texas, being deployed as Guard. And they're hearing, as they're being deployed, about cuts to the amount of money they will have to protect them while they're protecting us. Absolutely outrageous. You know, as we talk about doing what's best for America, And as we hear from people around the world that think of the United States as the great Satan, one would think, especially if they study history, that the last thing we would want to do is to hurt our national security, yet that is where we're going. It seems also clear that those negotiating from the Republican side during the debt ceiling bill made an assumption that turned out to be false, that Democrats in the Senate would never allow sequestration of $100, $200, $300 billion from Medicare. That was a bad assumption, because the same Democratic leadership in the Senate passed Obamacare, which brought about $500 billion in cuts to Medicare. So, of course, they were going to be willing to allow sequestration, because this time they would be able to blame Republicans for also being part of what caused the cuts. Cuts to Medicare and cuts to our national security. Not a good idea. Not a good idea. Well, National Review Online has an article in the last couple of days with some great information, and we have taken that information and put it in chart form from the article and double-checked, and apparently these are accurate numbers. These numbers, if anybody cares to contest them, actually come from President Obama's own Office of Management and Budget. It turns out that as this president and his administration has complained about not having money, not having the ability to make cuts, having to make draconian cuts to Medicare and to our national defense, his administration has been sitting on money, hundreds of billions of dollars of money that they haven't spent from 2010 and 2011. They're complaining about not being able to even cut $5 or $10 billion when it turns out they're sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars that have not been obligated, have not been spent from 2010 and 2011. So let's take a look at money that this administration has not been willing to cut, even though it's unobligated, it's unspent, it's been appropriated, they have the ability to spend it or save it or spend it for something else, and yet this administration just can't seem to want to cut loose from this money to reduce the deficit, to cut down on the money we'd borrow from China, to cut down on the deficit spending or the reduction in spending for the military, reduction in spending for Medicare. How about that? Turns out they're sitting on all this money. The Department of the Treasury, under the direction of Secretary Tim Geithner, hopefully he'll be okay getting his tax return in this year, he's sitting on $226 billion that was appropriated, and yet it is sitting there unobligated, unspent. Yet Timothy Geithner has told us, there's just no money to do what he felt like needs to be done. He was out there this summer saying we've got to raise taxes because this poor gentleman was not going to be able to cut loose, as we find out, of the $226 billion he's got sitting in change. And that is not even including the $125 billion that he still has in TARP